I recently wrote my first article for Forbes.com. I wrote the article and it was actually well received, got many thousands of views. The website got a lot of traffic from it. They were very pleased. They've asked me to do another one, which is amazing. But the article covered 101 of industrial real estate. It was titled 8 Things You Need to Know About Industrial Real Estate. And 2 of the topics I think are not really discussed at all in any kind of educational series I've seen online. Unless you really get thrown into the business, you really wouldn't understand that these things are even important or there. And the 2 really big takeaways from that article would be electrical service into the facility, what's necessary, what's required depending on the use, and the big ticket items, high dollar costs when you're investing in buying, selling, or leasing industrial properties or any property for that matter. The roof and HVAC are 2 of the biggest costs associated with property. So to take the first one, electrical service, it's really important to understand how much service is coming into a space or a building in total, especially if you're buying it. Critical to know, and leasing, it's also, I would say, equally important. If you're a manufacturing company or if you're a distribution company, the requirements are completely different. You're never gonna have the same. For a distribution company, maybe you need some, a generator outside or, some forklift charging stations. You gotta run the lights, you gotta run the power to the HVAC unit for the office, lights for the office, and maybe some other like low voltage stuff, but you're never gonna need very heavy power to run any kind of machinery unless you've got some kind of conveyor system, which is very rare. Only the highest level e-commerce guys use that kind of sophisticated equipment. A typical distributor would never really require much of that. So you don't really need heavy power. You probably need 200 amps at low voltage, 108 or 220 volt, maybe 3-phase, but probably not even, just to run the basic stuff in the warehouse. Now, when you are talking about a manufacturer, especially a heavy manufacturer, especially a glass manufacturing operation where you're making large panels of glass for office buildings, apartment buildings, things like that. You might have ovens. You're definitely going to have assembly lines. You're definitely going to have cranes because those panels of glass are super heavy. So they have these specialized suction cups that suck onto the glass on either side and they cart them across the warehouse. It's very cool to see. So you're going to use a ton of power. So you'll probably need, for like a real operation in about 60 to 80,000 feet for a window glass cutting factory, you're going to need 3,000 amps of power at 480 volt and 3-phase. If that's not already existing in the facility, you're going to be looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in investment into a space, which is obviously something you really need to understand before you sign on the dotted line. And if you're buying a facility, same thing. It's got to either be there or you have to install it. And if you're installing it, it could take upwards of 6, maybe even 8 months because you have to rely on FPL sometimes to upgrade transformers. And it's just a ton of work. It's something that's really important, and you've got to understand what your requirements are well before you even start searching for a space. Because if you find a space that you like, but then you realize it didn't have the power, you just spent all that time doing nothing, looking for the wrong space. So you really need a spec list of all your equipment before you even get started speaking to a broker or looking online for space. And that spec list should include every single piece of equipment's amount of power it uses, ampage, the volts that it runs on, and then when you add it all up, you got to make sure that it's in the space. The way that you make sure it's in the space is by checking the main panel. There are sub panels which are smaller. You can ignore those. It's really the main that's the most important. And depending on the thickness of the pipe, if it's got a really thin pipe, just a couple of inches, it's probably low voltage, like a 220, 108. If it's a really thick pipe, kind of like this size, you're going to be looking at 480 volt, generally speaking. If you open the panel and you look inside, there's usually a plaque or a plate that's either black and silver or silver, and it's usually etched in, and it'll say amps and volts. It'll also say what phase it is. It'll tell you if it's 400 amps or if it's 800 amps or if it's 1500 amps or whatever. It'll say it in there. And it'll also tell you what the volts are, which is really important. Now, you have to be very careful because sometimes it'll be labeled, but along the way, as the years go on, some people could have removed some of that power. So just because it says it doesn't mean the wires are actually there. So you have to get a qualified electrician to confirm everything. I've gotten in trouble for telling someone, hey, it says it right there, it's 400 amps, but they open it up and there ain't nothing in there. So you gotta be really careful and you gotta know what you're doing. So that's power in a nutshell. And when it comes to big ticket items like the roof and HVAC, you can always get contractors to confirm those things, especially if they think they're going to be getting work from you for servicing or for repairing or replacing that equipment. They'll absolutely go out there for free and do a complete and thorough evaluation and an estimate, and they'll work really hard to find something wrong so that you hire them to fix it. So it's a really good idea before the end of due diligence or before signing on the dotted line for a lease, that you get a HVAC and roofing contractor out to the building that you trust, that you like, to make sure everything is copacetic. Those reports usually take 3 weeks, I would say, just because everyone's so busy these days, all the subs and all the contractors. So I would get ahead of that really early on while you're in the LOI stage. If you selected a final property that you really like, go ahead and order that to get out there, get the landlord's permission, obviously, but go ahead and get out there and get that ordered as soon as possible, because there's a long lead time that you have to deal with. If there are issues with the roof, it can be negotiated in a contract or into a lease that the landlord address those before you moved in, and they're not charged back to you as a operating expense to the property, which can happen. So that'll save you a bunch of money and headache. And then regarding the air conditioning units, it's super important that those are working. I mean, like, air conditioning is as important as water or food down here. You just can't operate in a building without it in the office. So that's very important. If they're beyond, 7 years, I would probably have something worked into the contract where there's a cap put on your expenses, or maybe they'll just replace them before you move in. So that's something that a good broker will always address for their clients before they get too far down the line, very early on in the LOI stage. If you get too far down the road, they already know you're committed to the space. It's kind of too late to start asking for repair and replacements. So that's something to consider when you're looking for space or looking to buy a building. And that's just my 2 cents. And I hope everyone takes a look at the Forbes article on Forbes.com. You could search Larry Janae and go check it out. 8 things to know about industrial real estate.